Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Posas, the head of Research Services and Archives at the Autry Museum of the American West. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land, the Gabrielino Tongva people. I would also like to thank the Autry's generous donors and members for making this program happen. I'm honored, along with the Board of Trustees, to welcome you to the Artist Salons with a sneak preview of the exhibition, What's Her Story? Women in the Archives. This exhibition looks behind the scenes to share how archivists work to bring the more hidden narratives to light, weaving in and out of primary source evidence to color in details, amplify voices, and begin the discovery of women's stories. Before we go any further, I would like to mention that if you have any questions during our conversation, please enter them at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Joining me today is Dr. Marissa Lopez. Marissa is currently a professor of English and Chicano studies at UCLA. She studies Chicana X literature from the 19th century to the present, emphasizing 19th century Mexican California. Her first book, Chicano Nations, is about nationalism and Chicana X literature from the early 1800s to post 9/11. Her book, Racial Eminence, which came out last year, is a monograph about uses of the body and affect in Chicana X cultural production. Marissa is the current vice president of the Latina Studies Association, an academic organization that brings together scholars, students, activists, and community leaders in Latinx studies. She's also a past associate director of UCLA's Chicano Studies Research Center, past chair of UCLA's Committee on Diversity and Equal Opportunity, and past chair of both the Modern Language Association's Executive Committee on Chicano literature and its Committee on the Literature of People of Color of the US and Canada. Marissa, thank you for joining us for our Artist Salons today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So excited for this opportunity to work with Manuela's archive and the Autry.
I'm excited to have this conversation. But again, before we begin, I would like to remind you that during our conversation, you can enter at any time the Q&A, your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. The Autry Museum of the American West represents something slightly different to each of you who visits us physically and virtually. Before I begin the conversation, though, I want to point out a few things that I wanted to get across when developing What's the Story? Women in the Archives exhibit. One, having something to celebrate the spirit of the women's suffrage movement and the 100th centennial of women winning the right to vote. Two, revealing the compelling stories of women found in the Autry's collections, being one of the great defining strengths of our institution. And three, how the process of archive creation and long-range care of the archives determine the telling or level of discovery for these stories. So in some cases, you have the creators of the archives and the main subject of the archives intrinsically tied to one another, such as the Assistance League of Los Angeles, the Native Voices Archives, Carolyn Bowen Poole's papers, and Gladys Knight Harris's papers, women and institutions that are all featured in the exhibit that created their own archives to tell their own stories. Whereas in other cases, more footwork is needed in creating a story by bringing different archives together, such as the case with the first Native American woman anthropologist, Bertha Parker Cody, and as you, Marissa, well know, is needed to tell the story of Manuela Garcia. So I'm sharing this image that includes Garcia here in the middle. She is the one, can you see my arrow? She is the one, like, it looks like she's holding a child. That's Manuela Garcia. And I chose this image because I felt it reflected or mirrored her obscurity and the broad strokes of information we knew about her. She was most known for being Charles Fletcher Lummis's most valuable informant when it came to building his recordings of Spanish folk songs. Garcia recorded approximately 120 songs on wax cylinder for Lummis, mostly in 1904 to 1905, and her songs make up more than 1/3 of the Spanish language songs in the Lummis collection. But with the project that Marissa was part of, Versos y Besos, there's so much more that was found out about Manuela. Versos y Besos is a collaborative of artists and scholars and musicians that took a deep dive into the story of Manuela Garcia. And Marissa, through her part of the project, found a sense of place and location through a mapping project and other research discoveries. So my first question for you, and maybe the only question I'm able to ask given how many people are attending today, but is based on your experience with the Versus y Besos project, what did you learn about Manuela Garcia? Who was she, and how did her experience or does her experience fit within the context of Los Angeles at that time?
Sure. So one of the things that we did was we put together an online publication for a journal called ASAPJ, and we can send out the links to that. And that cluster of short online articles highlighted the work that we were doing. And the piece that I wrote for that cluster was about technology and how we can use technology, really broadly defined, to I think liberate is probably the best word, liberate the archive, specifically Manuela's archive, and resituate her in a Los Angeles that resembled the Los Angeles that she might have moved within in the early 20th century. So we know of Lisa, as you said, we know of her primarily through her collaboration with Lummis, but she was so much more than this collaboration. And one thing that we should remember is that she came to his attention. He needed her. And unfortunately, I haven't yet been able to find any archival information that would illuminate how she came to his attention or any of that early correspondence, how their paths first crossed. But we do know from her death record, which we found in the LA City archives, that she's born in 1867 and she died in 1931. So she's born right at just after the close of the Civil War, and at the height, she dies at the height of the Great Depression. So her life spans the turn of the century, which is a period of major, major change in Los Angeles. It's the period of time during which Los Angeles transformed from a small Mexican city to a major US metropolis. So Garcia is the child of middle-class parents. Her father's a bookkeeper. Her mom worked at home. And the family was very musical. And we know from the LA City directories that are digitized, and some are held at the Autry, some are held at the Los Angeles Public Library, but we know from these directories where they lived. And they moved around to several different residences, settling eventually on South Olive, just below First Street. Manuela, we know, was well educated. She gave a speech at her high school graduation that was reported on in the Los Angeles Herald. And we know this from the California Digital Newspaper Collection, which is an amazing resource run out of UC Riverside. They've digitized all of the newspapers printed in California from the very first issues of the Star, LA's first paper, moving forward. So the speech was reported on in the Herald. We know that she went to the Normal School, which had been founded just a couple of years before she graduated as a teacher's college, the Southern California Normal School. This later went on to become UCLA. There's no record of her graduating from the Normal School, but we do know also from the Los Angeles Herald that she graduated from the Los Angeles Business College, and that she went on to a career as a bookkeeper. She worked as a bookkeeper for Singer Sewing, and this we also know from city directories that we were able to find digitized. So she worked as, and these directories listed people's residences and their occupations. So we know she worked for Singer Sewing, and that she also worked as a Spanish teacher and also as a musician. And we know also from newspaper ads that she was a musical advisor to the very first stage production of Helen Hunt Jackson's novel Ramona. So she was significant enough and had enough social standing that her comings and goings were reported on in the papers. We find articles about birthday parties that she threw herself, little mentions of house guests that she had. So things like that. And that standing was most likely gained through her father, Ignacio, who was active in Los Angeles, an active was a trustee of the Spanish American Benevolent Society, which was a fundraising mutual aid society in Los Angeles. So these are things that we know about her that we were able to find, because she comes to us through Lummis's archive, but she is present in all these other scattered bits and pieces. So this is what we were able to put together for the project. So I think part of your question, but I might have been imagining it, was not just what we know of her, but how she fits within a broader context of Chicano and Latino lives. But am I jumping the gun, or was that part of what you asked me? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I think there needs to be a game every time somebody's presentations. But yes, I was curious to how you would position her during her time as she lived, like, where she fit in the bigger narrative about Los Angeles in that era, as well as like how she fits in the broader context of Chicano and Latina experience, and how in your if you were to focus on her in a class, like how would you present her?
And it's funny you should say in a class, because just before this, I just finished teaching my Chicano literature survey, which is from the Aztecs through the end of the Mexican Revolution. So she would fit right in there. And one day, well, the Autry's archives have been locked up for so long, but one day they will be open and available, and we can, get students in there kind of working with this material. So but here's how I would situate her in a class. So when we think of the Mexican American presence in California, really in the Southwest, but let's just think about California in particular. We think of this in kind of two waves, right? There's the early settlers and descendants of those early settlers, the landed gentry of California, the Californios, who came kind of beginning in the late 18th century. To settle, and then they became landholders. And this is the group of people that were in power during the Mexican-American War, and after the transition to US rule were really disempowered and divested. So that's the Californian population. So there's that, and then there's early 20th century migration, kind of waves of early 20th century migration as a result of really conditions in Mexico pushing people north. A variety of things, including the Mexican Revolution, which begins in 1910. So these two kind of communities, really disparate communities, that eventually smush together and become kind of the Mexican American population of California, and eventually the Chicano population. And Garcia and her family, they don't really fit into either of these groups, because they're not part of the landed gentry. Both of her parents migrated from Mexico, but they didn't migrate part of that kind of later 19th, early 20th century wave. Both of her parents came in the middle of the 19th century. So they're kind of interestingly isolated, like right in between these two major periods of Mexican presence. So they were definitely immigrants, but pre these waves of migration from Mexico in the early 20th century that spurred really nativist legislation like the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, which put national quotas on immigration and by country, and completely banned Asian immigration. So they were before that. And this means that her family definitely would have understood themselves as different from recent arrivals, 20th century immigrants. And it's also important to keep in mind that her career, right, and the time of her collaboration with Lummis also corresponds to the height of the settlement movement, which is a kind of social work movement that swept the country. I think the most famous exemplar of which is the Hull House in Chicago, but Los Angeles also had something similar called the Los Angeles Settlement Association, and there was a Casa Estelar in Los Angeles that was an organization that worked to assimilate these new arrivals from Mexico, while also trying to preserve and celebrate their culture. So there's this kind of social work movement of assimilation and uplift for these recent arrivals from Mexico that Manuela's career runs parallel to, even though she and her family would not have understood themselves as being in the same category of these people, but they definitely had a shared culture that there was a real push in the early 20th century to preserve, right? But even that movement to preserve is predicated on an assumption, or at least a desire for it to be kind of faded away, right? And regarded as an anthropological object, not part of the present life of Los Angeles. So this is how I would situate her kind of in the early 20th century, as a hinge between, kind of as a transition figure. And that's how I think that we should think of her as, and of her work as part of again, this desire to preserve Mexican culture, but preserve it by positioning it as a relic of a fading past.
Okay. I'm getting notes that people are hearing me in and out, so I'm going to put my headphones on really
Okay.
quickly. But if you can hear my question, I'm going to ask you a question, and while you answer this question, I'm going to put my headphones on. But one of the questions I had about uh, Manuela Garcia and her family and the upbringing she had is that she did have this huge repertoire of music, and apparently from memory she recorded in a notebook, not in the wax cylinder, but in a notebook she wrote lyrics to 149 songs. So was that commonplace? Was knowing these songs equivalent to today's television watching or music listening?
Yeah, and the Notebook is one of those things that I haven't been able to see in real life. I've just been able to see pictures of it, and so if I understand correctly, that the writing down of those songs, that was also part of her work with Lummis. So I'm gonna say it wouldn't have. It's not commonplace, right? Especially for somebody that came from such a musical family. So these would have been songs, Lummis called them Spanish songs, right? I forget the title of one of his first books was like Songs of Old Spanish California.
Yeah.
But
Spanish songs of old California. That's what
okay. I got all the words right in the wrong.
Yeah.
But they're they're Mexican folk songs. So these would have been songs that her lullabies, songs that her mom would have sung to her, and songs that they might have sung at family celebrations. And certainly music would have been more of a part of a family's life in the days before Spotify and smart speakers, right? So people had to do a little more work to entertain themselves, so probably like had a larger repertoire of songs in their head, but also to be able to remember those and recall those is similar to the ways in which I was just saying to somebody the other day that I think I still remember the theme song to Punky Brewster and Spoons and all those shows from the 80s. So it's not uncommon. She was certainly obviously very talented and very musical. So I mean, more to say on that though is that the songs that she wrote down are obviously songs that were an important part of her life and that she had running through her head, but they're not necessarily the songs that she would have been listening to or performing at any one of these birthday parties that she had for herself at her house. The songs that she wrote down are the songs that Lummis wanted her to write down, or the songs that she thought were the kinds of songs that Lummis was interested in. Right? So we know part of what she knew.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that is a question, is like one of the things with archives, it's part giving you the raw evidence of the material and context, but if part of the context isn't there, then you kind of have to fill in the blanks. And with her songbook, she did write it in 1901, and then I guess she gave it to Lummis, and Lummis started recording in 1904. So they could have been one and the same and influenced, or her songbook could have influenced his want or gave him or influenced how he does what he decided to record. So it's very interesting. And and all of this could just mean a deeper dive, right? A deeper dive into stuff that is, like you said, is currently locked up. And I totally understand that sentiment, because I am also itching to get back into the thick of the real world. But still, it still serves as an artifact that we can examine. Speaking of though archives, and say it's in the day when we can go look at the archive, or if I can get everything digitized and made available digitally, Manuela's story is still a bit hidden, as you know, because you did wonderful research in LAPL, and I would love to hear your journey of that. But again, as an educator, in wanting to have representation and inclusion of the story told about the Latino, Latina, Chicano experience, how would you prompt your students or guide your students to find those hidden or this, those stories that are not yet brought to light, but they're there, right? Like with all that Lummis did, like there's other stories there. So what sort of directives do you give them?
Well, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that all archives to a certain extent, like to a large extent, are invisible to most undergrads because they don't know what they are. And this is like one of the things that they learn when they come to college and they take a class with somebody like me. So they don't know what they are, and they don't get a lot of opportunity to work with them, especially at the undergrad level and especially at the K through 12 level. So the working with our archival and primary material has always been a really crucial part of my teaching, because they are a way to give students the experience of learning that all knowledge comes from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like all the things that they think they know, especially about Mexicans in the United
Mm-hmm.
States, those are stories that people have told them, right? So archival work gives students the opportunity to dig up their own data and tell their own stories. And part of my own pull towards the archives and why I make them such a big part of my teaching is that I remember being in graduate school and doing coursework and going to special collections when I was taking my whatever Victorian novel seminar. And there were all these cool old books and stuff, and I was like, well what about like people like me or people like my family? What about 19th, 18th century, even kind of Mexican America? Like, did we not produce cool enough stuff to be in the archives? So surely it's there, right? So kind of circling back to your question. So one of the most powerful things, and like digitization is hugely important, and thank goodness for digitization, because it means that like this kind of research can carry on in COVID times. But really a powerful experience that I have had personally, and that is always powerful for my students, is bringing them into special collections and just letting them, it feels like this is going to sound really cheesy, but like letting them touch old things, right? First, bringing them in and letting them see. Most of my classes are cross-listed with Chicano studies, and most of my students are first generation college students, or they're Mexican American or Latino in some form or variety. And they just, if they know anything about archives, it's like, oh yeah, that's where old stuff by like dead white people is, right? So just to bring them into this space and say like, no, like our history, your history is important and valuable, and it's here too. Like that is always, you can see, a mind-blowing experience for them. But then also like giving them the opportunity, again, just to touch, because I talk about post 1848, post Mexican American War, and how all these California land holdings, which I should stipulate were California land holdings because they were taken from native Californians, but these California land holdings were wrested out of their hands and into US and Anglo control, right? And all this is documented on these like old maps.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these maps are digitized, right? The California State Archives just digitized all the land grant case maps, so they can see them all, but like to touch them, just there's something really magical that happens, and that's really powerful. So I digress a little bit, but I'll come back to your question, which is how do you guide students, right? How do you give them this opportunity? So in another class that I'm teaching this quarter, I had an assignment, just by way of example, I'll answer your question. The class is Literature of California and the American West, but specifically about Los Angeles and this period of time that Manuela would fit into, right? The transition from Mexican City to Anglo Town. How does that happen, and what role does narrative play in this process? So we're reading like Ramona and assorted things, the Zorro, Mark of Zorro. But one of the things I had the students do, and my original plan was to have them work in special collections, but each student was assigned a rancho, an LA County rancho. So like I had, for example, one student, I'm looking around like I'm actually at my virtual background, but one student was working on Rancho Buenos Aires, which is the rancho that UCLA is now on. So each student got a rancho, and then I taught them how to use Calisphere and how to use the Calisphere in the Digital Public Library of America, which are two amazing resources. How how to kind of search for archival images and then how to record metadata. And so, very kind of basic archival work. So they had to find material related to their rancho and then record metadata and then build some kind of story out of the raw material that they were collecting. So with undergrads, you definitely need to give them a specific task. I have learned, like you can't just collection, find something interesting. They really need to be taught how to do this work. I mean, and this is where institutions like the Autry come in. I mean, your education program is so robust and so fabulous. I mean, to be able, it's a dream one day, be able to take small groups of students to the Autry and have them learn from kind of actual archivists and actual curators. I'm just an archivist groupie, but to be able to get that experience and to be in those spaces is really important.
We got a question in here asking about the land grant case maps. I believe you said the California Historical Society.
The California State Archives, and I mean, I can certainly make a link. I get you a link after the talk if you want to make that available to participants, or you can even just Google it, California State Archives land grant. I can't remember exactly what the collection is, but this was just a couple of years ago. This collection went live, and it's all of the maps for all of the cases that went through the 1851 Land Commission. So you can see every rancho, sort of. I should, with the caveat that these are hand drawn. They're designs, right? So they don't. It's kind of hard to. You can't just tell by looking at them necessarily.
Yeah, and maps, digital maps, even if you can end up reading them, they are. It's not. That is a great example of the difference between viewing the digital version and actually seeing the map, the actual map. And it's more than just like physical versus digital, but it's just easier to view a physical map, that physical map, than a digital map. Another question asked about LA Normal School and that it officially converted to UCLA. And yes, I did that because I did go to UCLA and that's where I did my library program. And so I knew about that history, but I also was able, before closure, I think January, February 2020, I was able to research the UCLA normal schools and see the enrollment of Manuela Garcia. And I think I'm pretty sure that's where we came up with the knowledge that she did not graduate from the UCLA normal school. Because what is written about Manuela, again, like broad strokes, always giving props and accolades to her, contribution to Lummis. And then they would talk about her family and they say she graduated from normal school. And when I looked at the records, it just showed that she didn't complete and therefore and wasn't part of the graduation records. But thank you, UCLA. I just have to do a shout out to Special Collections and Libraries there because we are able to borrow an images from that collection, and it is in the Women in the Archive, or What's Her Story, Women in the Archives in gallery exhibit that I'm very looking forward to opening it up when we can. But yes, thank you for that information. There are so many things that you had said that really resonate with me. One is just like first generation born going to college. That was me. I'm first generation born American, first generation in my family to go to college, and also was gravitated to the archives because that was a place where I found my history, the Filipino history and the Filipino American history that goes back to the Manila galleon trades, right? Or where this continent history. And I feel that thread is very common. And that's where, even though archives does have that reputation of that's where all the dead white men papers are, I know that there's archival materials is also on the flip side a place where people who are in the margins or underrepresented group can find evidence of their existence, for lack of a better phrase. It takes sometimes a little bit more digging. And I think, with that knowledge and without the shifting of things, these stories are becoming easier. And it's also, to me, pointing out this idea of community. So with Versos y Besos, it took a community to find the story of a community member. And I really want us to shift that way, as opposed to finding the hero, right, in
Mhm,
the archive, or
mhm,
finding that one champion, but actually looking at the community movement.
mhm.
Um, so that kind of also brings me to my next question, is the relevancy of Manuela. So, you know, when I first was introduced to Manuela, I've always, in the years that I was working with the Lummis Collection, have seen her as the informant, have seen her as a woman that just wanted to sing songs for Lummis and was shy, maybe, or, just kind of, even in her, we have her family albums as well. And in her family albums, there's not that many images of her. Um, so she could fade away. I mean, that's one of the questions we have, is like, if we don't document the silences, or the less represented in the archives, what does that say to our overall experience, right?
Mhm.
So where do you find the relevancy of her story, or how do you hook that relevancy to the students to say, like, it's worth digging for stories like hers because dot dot dot.
Hmm. So that's a tricky question, right? Because I mentioned earlier, I said earlier, like, we know what we have of Manuela still, we have because some archivists thought it was important. So we don't know necessarily what was important to her, right? So we don't have a way of accessing that. But so in terms of relevance, I mean, so that is, I would say, connects to our present moment, because this notion of like visibility and representation, these things are important, right? But Manuela's visibility and her representation is controlled and constrained by the politics of the archive, right? So visibility, we have to think in terms of visibility versus like political power, right? There are false correlates. So, for example, like that early 20th century celebration of Mexican culture that I talked about is happening around, driven by the Los Angeles Settlement Association and happening around Casa Estelar. They had art exhibits, they had music performances, all kinds of stuff was happening there. But that celebration of Mexican culture, and even Lemis's celebration of the old Spanish
Yep.
culture, was a way to contain it and to package it to Anglo tastes and relegate it to the past. What to ossify it and make it not relevant. Um, and then we see that same process happening throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. We saw something similar with the decade of the Hispanic. That was, you remember that? The 1990s was the
Hmm.
decade of the Hispanic. A
Hmm.
period of kind of hyper visibility, or perennial calls to like the sleeping giant of the Latino electorate that never really wakes up. And so then all this collective surprise about Latino Trumpers that everybody except Latinos were surprised by. Where like the general excitement about Bad Bunny breaking through the Grammys kind of Latino categories and crossing over. I'm All of which is to say, like, I'm not necessarily convinced that all that attention is going to lead to anything besides more of the same. And so the early 20th century was a period of kind of hyper visibility of Mexican culture that
Hmm.
was a prelude to like extreme disenfranchisement and disempowerment. And I'm holding my breath about 2021. Um, but I know maybe that's a little pessimistic, but um, I, I think this is a way of kind of circling back to this question of communities and archives as community resource, and how institutions like the Autry, or institutions like UCLA too, can empower communities as being their own archivists. Like, it's important for institutions like the Autry and UCLA to represent the communities
Hmm.
that they serve, and the communities in which they're embedded. But then it's also important to both to crowdsource and to empower communities to build their own repositories.
Hmm.
So anyway that institutions can do that is fantastic. And it's definitely something that we've been trying to do, or at least having conversations around doing with Manuela through Versos y Besos, because we can trace, through birth and death certificates. So this is very tedious and boring work. You maybe can look at like Manuela's brother's death certificate, and it has, his surviving relatives, and so you can go trace them and then see like where find their marriage records, and did they get married, and did they have children. And you can trace out her descendants and find them So, somebody can do this.
Now, were you the one that requested the death certificate of Manuela Garcia? So, in my research, when I was for this exhibit and I was researching Manuela, I was looking at published materials that I can find and had access to. And not only did they kind of give a circa birth year with no birthday, but a birth year, there was no like death year. It was just like she kind of died around this time. And so when my colleague Brittany Campbell, who also was like a great impetus in bringing Versos y Besos together, um, when she asked me if the recordings were in public domain, I said, we can't say for sure until we know of Manuela's death date. Because even though the recordings themselves, the date of the recordings, if you look at them flat, recorded in 1904, you look at like unpublished sound recordings, it's public domain. But the artists, like if the artist died, it's like something like 75 years after the artist's death, right? To be the most conservative, right? So it was possible that we were still within that non-public domain. But anyhow, all of that, all the math said, because we found out the death year, we were able to confirm that those recordings are in public domain, which really just happened recently. People might be surprised to know that they became in public domain January 1st, 2019.
Mhm.
So it wasn't, through your research, we came back to that, we can say that, and that brings about another level of accessibility and research, because with public domain, we can now make those recordings available
Yeah.
for people to download and stream, and they are available on the Internet Archive for streaming. But if a researcher asks, or or we can make it so that it's just available for people to do what you're supposed to do with artwork, right? To reinterpret, reinvent, and reinterpret. We do have another question in regards to the curriculums, and she's curious. This one person's curious about what is currently being done to integrate both materials and processes in K to 12, as well as community college curricula. Our local teachers in general offered exposure to these amazing resources. I could say quickly for the Autry, yes. And then Marissa, and I can explain more of that, but I would like to give you a chance, Marissa, to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that part of what we're doing in our group in Versos y Besos is developing, so just we're at the beginning stages of developing K through 12 material pertaining to Manuela. And then but these developing these kinds of materials, I mean, in the Autry, you have your own, like I was saying earlier, very robust education department. Like you can, in non-COVID times, bring students in and you can do programming, and you also train teachers, and you'll say more. But to develop material that can be available for teachers to use, this is a tremendous undertaking. It requires a lot of focus grouping and workshopping, resources to bring people together in some way, even virtually, so that we're not producing something in a top-down fashion, saying like, oh, we know all this stuff and we'll design these lesson plans and here you go. And those kinds of things rarely work, right? So you need to as long of a process as this can be, like it needs to be a collaborative, community-driven effort, and educators need to be a part of that process, because they know best what works in their classroom. I know a lot about early 20th century, late 19th century Mexican Los Angeles, but I know nothing about K through 12 education. I have 2 K through 12 children, but I would prefer to.
So you're learning more about K through 12 education, I imagine.
So much about K through 12 education.
I'm sure a lot of people here are learning more about K through 12 education.
We are trying to, and definitely that's on the event horizon for us. But the Autry is such an amazing resource. And so is the Los Angeles Public Library. So they have been very open to developing programming that would bring K through 12 students into their special collections space, which is, if any of you have done any work, I mean, that is just like mind blowing, because even UCLA won't let anybody under 18 into their special collections. So the fact that LAPL Central Branch has been, very open to this idea of finding ways to bring, fourth graders into their rare books to see, you know, the LAPL has a copy of the original city charter of Los Angeles.
Wow.
Mm.
Yeah, LAPL is really more than a library, and I would say that one book, the library book by Susan Orlean, did I get that right?
Yeah.
If anything that she did, she really drove home the idea that the library is more than just the library of books on shelves, and LAPL is a great resource for this city, this area. It has tremendous special collections. For the Autry, the education department has been working a long time with educators to work with K through 12 in lesson plans and the telling and experiencing elements of history through interactive programs. And I've been helping, assisting, being part of that, working with the educators. We used to do these summer workshops. For the library and archives, we always are always open to working with any level. This year, we did pilot out a Discovery Fellow program, which were 3 workshops we collaborated with Right Girl, a Los Angeles nonprofit organization that promoted creative writing to girls in Los Angeles. And so we had Right Girl alums, which were new college age students, and they came and worked with the archives, and they were supposed to do it for 3 workshops. So the element there was like, not only how do you find research, not archival research, but actually the process of taking care of archives, which archival research is an element. And there was this moment, speaking of touching the archives, which my friend calls the luminosity of archives, like the luminosity of the actual thing, right? We had these diaries in boxes, and we had 8 diaries, and we had eight girls or 8 women. And so they broke up in 2. And so I gave them the boxes, and I said, okay, you can uncover the boxes now. And when they uncovered them, it was just this gasp, right? Like they just like from them seeing these beautiful journals just made them gasp. And it was amazing. I didn't know that I had to record that. But yeah, I think there is that element of touching the item that really resonates that no words can. The other thing I wanted to mention is, did you know that LA County Archives has the original Rancho stamps on leather, like the actual original ones that you can
Not
access?
know that.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome for everybody that's interested. They're on these cool like leather patches, and they're brands, and then they're the brands of all the ranchos, and they treat them like, they're our records. So if you wanted to see them, you could see them. It's amazing. It's amazing when we can do that.
Yeah. Touch
um
things. When we can touch things again.
when we can touch things again, when I can touch people. Brittany Campbell. So I want to this is a good time to give a plug that the Versos y Besos Collective, we're having a conversation at 5:30 later today. So you can go to the Autry website. I think it's theautry.org/conversations and register for that. And again, that's happening at 5:30. And Marissa's going to be joining me, as well as Brittany and 3 others from the collective. And Britt just said that the Autry education, specifically Megan, is in the process of developing a curriculum for K through 12 around this particular project. So again, keep posted to the Autry page, especially the Autry education pages. And they've been doing a great job. They've been really pivoting, accordingly through these times, and just spit out in impressive time a lot of lesson plans that help educators as well as parents at home helping with education. So please take a look at that. Just wanted to make sure we're good on time. Yeah, so I have another question in regards to, let's just talk technology, because in a way, these recordings started with the technology of, paper, pencil. I think it's pencil and paper. And then Lummis himself said, I wouldn't be able to record and keep this archaeology alive, keep these songs alive without the technology of the Edison wax cylinder. And I was told by by another ethnomusicologist that I guess Edison used to have concerts where it's just like the real musicians and the wax cylinder player, and would ask the audience, it's like, you can't tell the difference, right? Which, come
You
on,
can now.
you could tell the difference. But that, just any thoughts on the interweaving of like technology throughout the whole course of the life of these songs, and how they've touched almost every, they've been re-recorded on almost every technological medium you can think of throughout, from the beginning to today.
Yeah. From the beginning to today. So the like I was saying earlier, the piece that I wrote for the ASAPJ cluster that we did was about technology, and thinking about thinking really broadly and philosophically about technology, like as, you know, techne, right? Like the way in which humans sort of engage the natural world, and like and shape the natural world, or kind of cohabit. So I was thinking about both all of the different technologies through which Manuela is visible to us.
Aha.
Things like, well, things like the writing, things like the recording, but then also technologies of finance, because we have checks that Lemus wrote to her, the technology of the typewriter, because we have things that she typed, we have, you know, technologies of biopower, because we have her census data, and we have her birth and death records, and all these the different machineries of both art and the state that produce her for us. So those, I was interested in that. At the same time, then I was also interested in, you know, technology, the way the term is commonly bandied about today, right? Like smartphones, or how we can use. So we have technology, all the different interesting ways in which Manuela is visible to us, and then technology in terms of all of the tools that we have to make her visible in these new ways, right? To bring her out of the archive and into the space, even if it's just the virtual space of Los Angeles, and the attendant concerns and questions that that raises, right? Like, who has access to technology, right? So we did this cluster for ASAPJ, so it's an online thing. So like, who's going to read that? Like, who has access to that? Who has access to a computer? Who has access to broadband? So who does that reach? And who has access to smartphones, and how many people use smartphones, and what are the kind of limitations of that? So there's it's kind of like the leitmotif of everything that I'm saying today, right? Technology is both really liberating, but also really constraining. Different late 19th century technologies make Manuela visible, but then also, you know, hide and constrain her. They make her visible in these limited ways. Similarly, we have all of these tools at our disposal, but then we also have to think about access, right? Like, those tools are only limited in their efficacy. Their efficacy is predicated on like who has access to them and who can wield them. So that's been a dueling concern of mine. And so one of the things that I made for the ASAPJ piece was a story map, right? So it's a kind of GIS enabled map. If you look at it on your smartphone, you can move through this, you know, a few blocks of space where Manuela moved within, and, you know, you get these little pop-ups. So I made that, but it's flat, right? It's on the web. So this is a kind of open question for me still, like, how can I use those tools to do the same thing for people with less resources who are like physically kind of moving in those spaces? I think that's a really big question, right? The the digital divide. Sorry, I knew that I knew what the phrase was, which is even, it's more pressing. It's pressing in so many different ways, especially in K-12 education, right? To come back to that, but because part of like the spirit of what we're doing with Manuela in particular is trying to put this woman back in the spaces. Well, I was going to say that she belongs, but I'm now self-conscious of me being a 21st century researcher telling her where she belongs. But to bring her back into the space
Yeah.
of Los Angeles. You know, how to do that in the most kind of equitable and accessible way
Mhm.
possible. That's been a concern of mine. But to circle back to what you were saying about all the different ways in which she's been recorded, just in terms
Mhm.
of technology of sound, I feel like that at least is one way, one mode in which the digital divide is not as onerous, I guess, or sinister. I can't think of
Yeah.
the right negative word, because you know, who can listen to Wax Cylinders? Like nobody,
Exactly. Yeah.
really nobody, because they're locked up.
Yeah, and even when, it went to wax cylinders and all these different permutations, you still needed to physically come with an inside the building to listen to the cassette tape, the reel to reel, the wire recording, the lumen disc, the shellac disc, whatever it was. It's with digitization can we truly like distribute it the
Yeah.
way that I feel Lummis wanted it distributed, just like make it rain, wax cylinder, make it rain, Spanish folk songs, right?
Maybe not those would be painful with a wax cylinder.
But so I just think it's really interesting that we started with this, at least the recording started with this brand new spanking technology, and we're now using it again to make it distributed. But then with what Los Calibre did in re-recording the song, it does go back to the auditory and the physical and the analog. If you look at their actual, if you want to look at just like their raw performance, right?
Yeah.
It just came from there. But we do have time for I think one more question, and it's to you. Well, one person asked me about what I wish attendees can see in the Women What's Her Story exhibit. Man, it's an exhibit made by an archivist. So there's like content. So I can't narrow it down to one. It's a small space. So maybe it's a meditative space of archival contextual components. So I just want you to see that space. But Marissa, what is something you've discovered in working with Latinx archives, and what is your hope for first generation students who want to pursue archives and Latinx studies?
Huh. What is something that I've discovered working in Latinx archives? Okay, I have a lot of funny archive stories, but one of the people that I have done a lot of work on, it was actually my first published article, was about Hubert Bancroft and his relationship with Mariano Vallejo. So Hubert Bancroft was a historian and book publisher in San Francisco in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. Mariano Vallejo was a Northern Californian, California, who was really like one of the most powerful and wealthiest men in the state at the time of the transition to U.S. rule. So basically, like all of Vallejo was his rancho. And he built the Sonoma Barracks. And he has a house up there near the Sonoma Mission. So I was doing research at the Sonoma Barracks because basically, like his household is just packaged up and is in the barracks. Like it's the California State Parks manages it. So it's like a little library, except there's no actual library. It's just a storage facility that has acid-free boxes and a lot of furniture and stuff. And so, I was there just like digging through boxes and like, oh, hey, well, what's here? Like, oh, look at this. It's like a year's worth of grocery lists. Like, I didn't know that people in the 1880s wrote grocery lists. That's interesting. But it's just kind of crawling around, moving furniture around, because they're, unlike some other institutions that shall remain nameless, they're very open. They're like, oh, great, like come in and look at our stuff. So they just opened up the storage facility for me, and they're like, here you go. We'll be in our office if you need us. So I'm digging around, but it's a barracks that are attached to the mission, right? So there's school groups coming through. And I'm thumping around, and I hear this group of kids I'm in an underground place, and they're walking overhead, and I'm thumping, and I hear one kid go, ah, did you hear that? Did you hear that? And another kid's like, it's a ghost. And then the pitter patter, and they run away. But so that's my like very funny story. But one of the things that I unearthed is I'm gonna turn off my virtual background so I can just show you. It's so cool and bizarre. It's a photograph that was so cool and bizarre. I blew it up and I framed it in my office. So here's my office that I will show you. The most interesting archival item I have ever found. My office is very messy. But can you see these two pictures on my wall? So the first, sorry, I'm making everybody car sick. The first there that I think is on your right is these are Mariano Vallejo's daughters. And then on the left is also Mariano Vallejo's daughters, but that's a spooky, it's just spooky and very weird and very strange. And so I found this picture and I was like, please, park ranger, can you make me a digital copy of these pictures? I promise I won't use them for anything except my office.
Yeah.
And I use them and I teach them because I think they're just so strange and I don't know the narrative behind them. They're weird. And they're both revealing, you know, it says they let their hair down and it's so revealing and it's almost risque. It's kind of sexy, but also it's like so it's like an intimate invitation, but then it's also a refusal because they've turned their backs to the camera, right? They're both letting you see, but still controlling the field of vision. And it's, I feel like if I were a talented short story writer, which I'm not, I'm just good at reading short stories, I would be able to write something really good about that if I had any talent. But that,
or maybe Amy Shinto Santo can write something.
maybe.
Poetry.
Oh, you know what? She really could. But I think there was a second part to that question. I got a little sidetracked with my spooky lady photo.
We are coming to a close though, so maybe we can type back answers. So maybe you can type back your answer, or the person who asked this question, if you want to join us to the conversation happening at 5:30, we can start off with that question or weave this question into, because I think it actually is a really great question, probably something that will be asked next time. But I want to thank you, Marissa, for joining us today for Autry Artist Salons, and again, thank you all for taking the time to hear on how uncovering through the archives and one woman's story leads to multiple stories, which is why the overarching slogan, if you will, of the What's Her Story exhibit is at the heart of every story is an archive, and at the heart of every archive is a story, which kind of resonates with something you said earlier today, Marissa. Like I said, we'll be continuing the public conversation later today at 5:30 with the rest of the Versos y Besos collective. You can register for the event at theautry.org/conversations. Also on Wednesday, December 9th, please join us with Autry board chair David Cartwright for a unique artist salon featuring musician Chris Pierce. Register at theautry.org/artist salons. And thank you again, Marissa. I look forward to seeing you in a half an hour.
Yeah, same here. Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Encanto de mi amor, tú eres un ángel bajado del cielo que le da consuelo a mi pobre corazón. El sauce y la palma se mecen con calma, sus hojas se tiñen de nácar y azul. Qué hermoso es el ruido del sauce y la palma, alma de mi alma.